Hello and welcome to a brand new show of Reflections with Hiba, right here on Radio Azad, 104.9 FM HD3, and available on the Radio Azad app anywhere in the world. So make sure you download it. Studio phone number is 972-501-9390. I am very excited to be starting the new year on a very delightful note, which is that I get to be in conversation with one of my favorite authors, Jeff Brown. Jeff Brown is a former criminal lawyer, psychotherapist, and author of 7 best-selling books, many of which I have read and many of which have been extremely instrumental in helping me in my emotional and spiritual journey. I have with me all the way from Canada, Mr. Jeff Brown himself. Hello, Jeff. So, Jeff, your style of writing is extremely refreshing. It's not the typical spiritual saga guru style, which is long and verbose. Yours is just raw and real. How is that something that you came up with?
I had a calling to write that was encoded in me forever. I knew from a young age I was going to write, and I think I've lived a pretty raw and real life, so my languaging, I think, just reflects how I've functioned in my life. Yeah.
And I think it is that style which is so relevant in today's world because it's to the point, it's succinct, and it's very articulate. And I think in today's fast-paced world, I think that is what people appreciate the most. One of the things that I know you have talked about, you also have a course available on, is narcissism. Narcissism is a big buzzword. Everyone is very fascinated by it. Tell us about it. What according to you, is narcissism?
I would call it there's a large continuum, but a very unhealthy degree of self-absorption as opposed to a sometimes healthy and necessary degree of self-absorption, that can move from a very subtle and not particularly toxic level and can move often in the other direction and becomes, very Trumpian. He's a classic example of a hardcore super toxic narcissist. And, it's an interesting thing asking for me the question, where does this come from? My experience has been it comes from 2 very different places that lead in the same direction. I've known really hardcore narcissists that didn't get any real needs met in the early stage of their lives. And so they have a desperate need to finally get validated attention and be in charge and in control. And others who got over-validated at an early age and just got so comfortable with that way of living that they continue to function in that way. But in either case, end up in a narcissistic or unhealthy sense of self framework of perception.
Do you think there's anything that can be done to help a narcissist get out of it? Any tools?
I would think that the most toxic or pathological narcissists, it's very unlikely you're going to make much of a difference on a therapeutic level. I've never known one that just sort of woke up one day and decided that they were in need of help and were interested in getting help, because my experience is they actually don't have a solid enough egoic structure to be able to make admissions around their own faults and issues. And I think that's the heart of all of this is some of us can acknowledge our problems and our issues and can go into a therapeutic process to engage them. But people with a really fragmented ego, which are often narcissistic and manifesting as largely egoed, are usually the people that don't have the egoic strength or solidity to acknowledge their problems. So in the extreme cases, I don't think there's too much you can do. But if we're talking about people who are just unhealthily self-absorbed, but not malignant or particularly toxic, then sure, I think it's possible. I think it always has to come from inside of them, but I don't feel like, I think we have to be careful with buzzwords. It's somebody goes on a date with somebody and the person never calls them back and they call them a narcissist. We have to be careful. It's not that simple. We're talking about something much more precise, much more real, much more significant, and much more problematic. And so I wrote a course that's on my jeffbrown.co website, a download course that's doing very well around it. And I was very careful to language it in the broadest possible sense,
Mhm.
while at the same time making sure that people didn't call everybody that pisses them off or rejects them a narcissist.
Because that could also be very narcissistic to think that anyone who rejects
Yeah.
me
Yeah,
is a
it's
narcissist.
all about you. Right. I mean, because it's an important distinction between a narcissist
Mhm.
and what's called a narcissistic wound. For many of us, when we're triggered, if we have a lot of trauma, we enter into a narcissistic wound state or structure where we feel, in a way, like it's all about us. We were
Right.
rejected, we were abandoned, we project all kinds of things onto the other. That's not exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about a narcissist. But it's important to talk about it because we all have the capacity to enter into a narcissistic wound structure when we're in our triggers. And, I think it's important to come back to the distinctions between these things, but also to go back to the source material to understand where all of this is emanating from in order to help to understand what this word really means.
Now, your course, I think, is something that when I read about the first time, I was like, wow, I think even today in the world of counseling and therapy, a lot of professionals are still not very well versed or trained in narcissism. So I think your course is something that's extremely, it comes at a really good time because people really need to know how to handle these things. Is it meant more for how to deal with narcissistic people in our lives or for the narcissists themselves? But I doubt they would really know that they are.
No, the course is primarily for exclusively really for people who have been in contact with a narcissist and want to heal the woundedness that emanated from that dynamic. And I do spend some time on people who have to remain in contact with a narcissist, whether it's an ex or a parent, and with some strategies on how they can do that in a way that's more self-preserving.
Got you. And where can we learn more about this course from? Tell us more.
The course is on jeffbrown.co. In the audio courses, there's, I think, 8 or 9 audio course downloads available at a sliding scale price.
Okay, got you. Now, another thing that you mentioned, and you're right, it's another buzzword, is that anytime we feel challenged, threatened, questioned by people, we want to say, oh, they're toxic and I need to cut them off. Now, I don't particularly think that's a very healthy way to go about life because, again, people come into our lives for different reasons. And if we started just doing that, we would be pretty lonely. How can we, what's a healthy way to think about this word toxic?
Hmm. I mean, in terms of, I think the movement towards a more genuine, authentic experience is often a movement towards finding what I called in my first book, Soul Shaping, your soul pod. Um,
Mhm.
People of essential resonance. And I think when you start to move in that direction, you do naturally shed what we might call toxic people. And we can define that in a lot of different ways, but in the most authentic way of defining it, I would define it as those people who undermine, intentionally or not intentionally, our movement towards a more authentic and inclusive and healthier experience of self. So, but that doesn't mean that you give up on everybody after one toxic outbreak. I mean,
Sure.
you're right. And I think that's what you're talking about, that,
Mhm.
you want to be, selective attachment, I think, is very important on the path if your movement is in the direction of something we might call wholeness or emotional health. You have to selectively attach. You have to decide who you want close to you vibrationally because it matters who's close to you vibrationally.
Mhm.
But, at the same time, you don't want to give up on every single person, particularly people who are closely aligned with you in your family of origin. Um, so for me, I ended up shedding almost everybody from my family of origin because of the toxicity.
Mhm.
But then a few came back when it was very clear that they were also waking up to the willingness to do the deeper work, to be more emotionally healthy, to relate more authentically, to become more conscious around our trauma and our ancestral patterns and how they were living themselves out relationally. And, after you do enough of this for long enough, I think two things happen. I think, first of all, you really only want to get really close to people that are resonating with where you've come to.
Mm-hmm.
But you also can become, because you're more solid and sturdy and boundaried in the self, you can handle some of the unhealthier members of the family, not the destructive ones, but the unhealthier ones, without taking it so personally that you have to push them away. And maybe that's what has to happen. It has to happen in you. At first, sometimes you have to get rid of everybody in order to
Mm-hmm.
establish a new sense of self. But once it's established, you may find that some of those people can come back and come along for the ride, and their faults or difficulties or impossible aspects become slightly more tolerable.
I like that. Jeff, one of the things that you talk about in your books, and I have read Articulations, which I strongly recommend, is just such a phenomenal read because it's simple, it's to the point, it's so articulate. It's something I've gifted actually to my very close friends. You talk about this idea of healthy anger. Tell us about that.
Well, I think anger has been vilified in the spiritual and religious world and in the culture for some cases good reasons, because of horrible actings out of misplaced aggression, passive aggression, all that. But also, it's a control system. I mean, if the guru gets you to not gossip, to not judge, and to never be angry, he can get away with everything.
Mm-hmm.
So can the religious leader. So it became evident to me in my somatic psychotherapeutic journey. I did some work with Alexander Lowen, one of the co-founders of bioenergetics, and I did a lot of anger work. And I bought a foam cube that I have with a baseball bat, and I shred pictures of people that I'm angry at on the cube. And I just found this was, for me, and growing up in an environment where expressing my anger and tantruming, I think it preserved the integrity of me as a human. If I had just endured all the abuses and never moved my legitimate anger, my justified anger, I think that I would have become an absolute mess, incapable of manifesting in my lives, because you just get bunked up with all that stuff. So I think it would be very helpful if we were to acknowledge the value of healthy anger release. And, I think in every corporate and family environment, there should be a little room with a foam cube with some baseball bats for people to move their anger, and to begin to learn the distinction between healthy and unhealthy anger, and more importantly, healthy anger release versus unhealthy anger release. Unhealthy anger release is you go to the bar and you punch at a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy anger release is you go into your room and you maybe print off a picture of somebody you're angry at, and you tape it to your bed or to your foam cube, and you grab a tennis racket or your fist or whatever you want, and you smash the shit out of it until you feel better. And I think these are important distinctions, because the repression of anger, well, that material congeals inside of us, and you just end up basically a lunatic, an enraged lunatic who's unable to distinguish who you're angry at from the past from who you're interacting with in the present. So the feel is for real, and you have to move the stuff. It's just, you have to move the stuff. And for me, the movement of the stuff, for me, emotional maturity and spiritual maturity are synonymous. So if somebody isn't able to deal with their feelings, they can't claim to be in an awakened state, because, that's dissociated. We want to be alive to our feelings. We want to clear the old material. I call it the power of then. You can't be in the power of now if you haven't dealt with the power of then, the old material that's inside of you. And then you get current with yourself. So you sometimes, maybe you book a day where you just decide you're going to get caught up with yourself emotionally, release what you're holding, get in touch with what you're holding, so that when you go back out into the world the next day, you feel fresh and like a new person again.
For those of you tuning in, I'm in conversation with Jeff Brown, renowned author of 7 best-selling books, who does a lot of amazing writing and work on the subject of emotional healing, dealing with trauma, becoming better versions of ourselves. Jeff, a lot of what you're talking about, in terms of healthy anger, narcissism, a lot of my shows talk about a lot of these subjects. One of the things I want to get your view on is, how do you explain, or where do you think toxic masculinity comes from?
I mean, I think we come sociologically from a survivalist way of being, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to a more authentic way of being. So, we defined who we were by what puts food on the table. And so much of that had to do with gender polarities and men protecting the village and men going off to war and men going off to hunt and to kill and all those particular roles and functions. And I think that when you're in that state of being, not really allowed to, in order to do your job, drop deep into the surrendered, receptive heart, it's very easy to tip over in the direction of a more toxic masculine structure. And I just think, we have to look at it sociologically before we look at it psychologically. And now I think we're moving to a more gender fluid, gender inclusive way of being, where people will feel more comfortable. We're seeing this with young people all the time now. I think it's beautiful. An opportunity to ask ourselves who we are on a gendered level or on an assertive versus receptive level on a daily basis. And I think over time, this will get rid of toxic masculinity, so long as the world that we live in becomes more just, and where abuse of power begins to fade out and all the rest of that. We live in a more inclusive, heart-centered, conscionable way, where there's more safety on a primal level. I think toxic masculinity will fade away. Until then, I think we need to assert really strong, rigid, and hardcore boundaries against it, because as we see, particularly lately in America, it's still remarkably prevalent. I mean, those hardcore right-wingers, and I'm not talking about the centrists, I'm talking about the hardcore right-wingers, well, they're kind of like toxic masculine T-Rexes that are going to eat the world one last time before progress takes over. So we have to be very careful, because it's a very dangerous consciousness. It's a very self-referential consciousness. It doesn't know much about anything outside of itself. It's unhealthily egoic. It's intrinsically narcissistic, and it's deadly dangerous. And at the same time, it makes sense sociologically to me why it happened.
And I think you say it really well that, we're in this period of transition, and you can tell that men and women both, I mean, and I speak especially from a South Asian perspective, that there's men are confused because they only know the model that they've seen. They only know their fathers, grandfathers, who unfortunately majority did exhibit toxic masculinity. The way to control was through anger, and was to be, very emotionless. And women who knew one way, which was to please and be subservient to the man because he was the provider. And we're seeing that shift happening. I think it's unsettling for many, because men don't know who to be if they're not the angry man that everyone's fearing. And women don't know who they are if they're not constantly just nurturing and providing. And then you see a lot of, I would say, some level of resentment as well as pushback by a lot of men in our culture towards feminism. They think it's almost used as a slur. You're a feminist. Why do you think that is, or how do you define feminism? Let's start with that.
Well, I think feminism is primarily about acknowledging and integrating the equal rights of women, which makes me feel safer in the world, in fact. But that's not how everybody feels. But if we just go back to kind of how you introduced that question, it's like, I mean, I think we come from a polarized consciousness sociologically in our conditioning. I think we're shifting rapidly, almost way too rapidly, for most people's consciousness to adapt. I think we have to be very realistic about how long it takes for people to shift habits as individuals and as groups collectively. It doesn't mean we have to tolerate abuse, but I think we should be somewhat compassionate towards the pace of human transformation right now, by comparison to, what's possible. I mean, most humans know sustainable growth happens slowly. You can have peak experiences, you can have, aha moments, whatever you want to call them, but integrating them within your whole system as a new functioning way of being takes a very long time. And that's why people often go 3 steps forward and 2.9 steps backwards. And that actually is the way to go if you want to have sustainable transformation. So right now we're in an incredibly confusing time. Most people are conditioned to survivalist structure, where you define who you were based on these polarities. Some of us are moving towards a more authentic way of being, which includes internal inclusivity, relational inclusivity, cultural inclusivity, wholeness, right? Instead of specializing in the thing that allowed you to survive, becoming all the things that you're meant to become, including asking yourself what your deeper essential purpose is. Not your vocation that will get you through this world financially, pay off the house and all those things. That's important. But now we've added a whole other question, which is, who are you really? Some of us are taking the bait. I'm writing for those people. I love that. But I also understand that it's a very, very difficult bridge crossing, and we have to really understand on a nervous system level, on a transformative level, that these changes, if they're going to take root in a real way, are going to take a lot of time because they've been with us for thousands of years, these patterns. And, plus we're only now beginning to recognize, see, survivalists don't think about how traumatized they are. They're in a survivalist frame of mind, right? So you look at all the people at the Trump rallies, it's not hard to see that they don't know how traumatized they've been. They don't realize why they're there. They don't realize how messed up they are. They're in a hardcore, old-style, toxic survivalist consciousness. We stand on the shoulders of survivalism, so we need to understand that. We're only here talking about trauma because somebody before us ignored their trauma, built the railroads in the middle of minus 40-degree temperatures to build the world we're standing on foundationally, so we can start talking about trauma. But the reality is, culturally, we're only really now going deep into a recognition that we're all trauma survivors carrying all kinds of individual and ancestral material. And so this is just the beginning of the realization phase where we begin to understand how messed up we've been and how we've been in adaptations and disguises and defining that as the self, when in fact the self, the whole other self, is waiting on the other side of the bridge. So it's a beautiful thing that's happening, but I think we need to really understand, to do this right, it's going to take a long time.
Sure. And I think along that journey, we need to be compassionate and empathetic, because it's unsettling for, I think, both genders. We're all in this transition. And I think sometimes we become more combative towards each other because it's like, we're trying to stick to who we know we are, as opposed to embracing who it is that we can be.
I mean, I think that, yes, I think that, if I think about like what kind of orientation will help us along with this, I think for me, in my experience, this thing I call sacred purpose. You can call it whatever you want, divine purpose, your callings, your gifts. To me, moving humanity in the direction of defining who they are in relation to what's encoded in them for this incarnation,